Denisovan origins, hybrid humans, Göbekli Tepe, and the genesis of the giants of ancient America. Today we have author Andrew Collins, and we trace the migrations of the Denisovans, giants throughout the world, their culture and technological influences, and also their inbreeding with Neanderthals and early human population in Asia, Europe, Australia, and the Americas. And it shows that without that early hibernation, the modern world as we know it would not exist. That's what our guest today, Andrew Collins, says. This is Truth Be Told. I'm Tony Sweet with Captain Ron. Please welcome the one and only Andrew Collins. All right, we're here with Andrew Collins all the way over the pond. He's back again. It's been a while. How you doing, Andrew?
Yeah, I'm fine. Suffering a little bit from a cold, but it's not going to stop me getting excited about all of the recent discoveries around the world.
And that's one reason we love to come back to you, because you always have the good stories and the good research and the good discoveries. And so thank you for coming back. And
yeah.
As we were saying in the intro, that your new book, this looks like a really good one. And we're going to start with that. And just how did you put this book together? I mean, you've put several books together before, but what was this one? How did this get started?
Well, it's called Denisovan Origins. It's co-authored with my good friend and colleague Gregory Little. I'd done some work on the Denisovans in the previous book that I did called Cygnus Key, which came out in 2018.
Right.
But there was just so many new discoveries, coming out to do with the Denisovans, who they were, and their importance to an impact on our own civilization, that I realised I had to do something else. So I asked Greg to come on board because obviously he is an expert in Native American traditions, mound building cultures of America, and also paleogenetics. He could see the vision from the perspective of America, and I could see it from the perspective of the Eurasian continent. This seemed to be a perfect combination, because the Denisovans themselves are essentially a lost cousin of humanity, which we didn't know anything about until 2010.
That's
when
amazing.
A tiny finger bone that had been found in this place called the Denisova Cave in Siberia was analysed and found not to be that of a human, not to be that of a Neanderthal, but to be that of a completely new species of hominin, or archaic human, as they call them, who we didn't know anything about. I mean, their genome was so different to ours or to the Neanderthals that they were immediately given their own name, which was Denisovan. And the importance
what does that mean?
Well, it comes from the Denisova Cave. That's how it's pronounced.
Oh, okay.
And Denisova relates to the name of a hermit who occupied the cave in the 18th century. I mean, he's obviously an ascetic. He went out there, lived there, did his own thing, and that name became connected with that cave, even though the locals actually refer to it as Bear Cave in the local Russian dialect that they speak in Siberia. But what's important is that they found various other, what they call fossil remains, in other words, bones and teeth relating to these Denisovans inside the cave, and almost all of them are in the same occupational layer, and this same layer has produced the most extraordinary evidence of advanced human behaviour, suggesting that it's come from the Denisovans. And this includes the so-called Denisovan bracelet, which if any of your listeners don't know, just Google it now, Denisovan bracelet, and you'll see this beautiful green stone bangle or bracelet that was manufactured at least 45 to 50,000 years ago, which is basically the last time that the Siberian Denisovans were around. I mean, they'd been around before that for hundreds of thousands of years, but they seemed to die off shortly after this time, essentially coincident when we turn up, and I'll come on to that side of the story in a minute. But they produced this fantastic, item that we now call the Denisovan bracelet. It's made of a type of stone called chloritolite, which actually changes colour slightly from daylight into artificial light, something which almost certainly was one of the reasons why this particular substance was chosen to create this beautiful piece of jewellery. But beyond that, a whole number of firsts have been discovered in the cave. The earliest musical instrument in the form of fragments of a whistle or a flute dating to about 50,000 years ago, suggesting that the Denisovans had knowledge of music and how to create musical notes. The earliest bone needles anywhere in the world suggesting that the Denisovans had tailored clothing. The earliest evidence of horse DNA and bones, which have suggested to some scholars that the Denisovans may have domesticated and perhaps even ridden horses as far back as 45,000 years ago. They found used pencils of ochre, which were either used, for body paint or perhaps for rock art, or perhaps even drawing symbols and glyphs, something like that. And beyond that, and this is most important for, to try and understand who they were and their impact on us, is that a certain type of tool manufacture went on here and also in the surrounding region as far away as Mongolia, which is distinctive as unique not just to the Denisovans being the earliest time that it appears, but this same type of tool manufacture, which is known as microblades, manufactured by something called pressure flaking,
Right.
is something that's really difficult to do and gets adopted by our earliest ancestors who arrive in the same area. And subsequently, it is carried into Europe, into China, into Southern Asia, as waves of activity, showing us that the influence of the Denisovans had an impact on our ancestors around 45,000 years ago, and that thereafter they were carrying their innovation and ideas, and almost certainly their DNA and ancestry into different parts of the ancient world. And I think this is really, really important because we very clearly, interbred with them. And once the Denisovans disappear from the scene, their legacy is passed on to us so that we continue it on. So in other words, even though they may have been wiped out, perhaps even by us, the sons and daughters of this interbreeding learn the skills of their Denisovan fathers, if you like, and that gets passed down through the different generations and is carried into other parts of the ancient world. And some of these ideas are almost certainly the rudiments of civilization. And in addition to all this, just in the past couple of weeks, it's been revealed that a beautiful artifact, which is a figurine of a cave lion made from mammoth ivory, was found in the Denisova cave within the Denisovan layer. And this has a series of notches on it that seem to suggest an interest in the lunar cycles and possibly even eclipse cycles. And this dates back to 45,000 years ago. And I'd already said, both in the Cygnus Key and in Denisovan Origins, that the evidence of a knowledge of eclipse cycles seems to begin in the area of southern Siberia just after the time of the Denisovans. And now we know that that knowledge could actually have come from them directly. So they had a knowledge of the movement of the sun and the moon and the conjunctions of those two celestial objects, which is obviously what we know today as the eclipses. And what's so interesting is that all around the world, there are obviously different animals associated with the idea of an eclipse. And in certain countries, the lion is actually seen as one of the the creatures that bites into the sun or tries to swallow the sun and causes blood to flow from it, which is, where we get this term, the blood moon, from at the time of an eclipse. And I find that interesting, so that the choice of this figurine being a cave lion may well have been a deliberate part of a knowledge of a primitive cosmology associated with not just eclipses, but the creature seemed to be associated with the creation of that. Now, what this figurine represents is still a matter of speculation, but it's highly polished. Unfortunately, the head's missing, but we have every other part of it. And it may well have been some kind of talisman, perhaps for a child to hold, but maybe at a time of eclipse, or maybe at a certain time of the lunar cycle, to protect them, to give them some kind of comfort, like a comfort toy. So, yeah, I mean, there are other things which they invented as well. We'll come on to those as we go along.
Well, I want to ask you this, that's very fascinating. And I'm trying to find out the importance of the
Denisovans.
Yeah. And
not Denisovans, Denisovans.
Yeah, I got to make sure I say that right, because I know I've heard it multiple different ways.
Yeah.
But I'm just kind of curious on when they were around, the Neanderthals were also around. So how did they interbreed, or to create modern man, or is modern man already there and just kind of interwoven with all groups?
Well, all three of us, Denisovans, Neanderthals, and anatomical modern humans, that's us, Homo sapiens, we all have a common ancestor. Mm-hmm. In other words, we all come from the same branch of the tree, so to speak.
Right.
Now, who that common ancestor is, we don't really know. I mean, they suggest it's a type of so-called hominin or archaic human known as Homo heidelbergensis, who would seem to have been quite active in Africa, but also in Europe, and possibly in parts of Asia as well. And they're certainly around from 700,000 or 800,000 years ago down to maybe, let's say, 400,000 years ago, maybe slightly later. But sometime around 400 to 500,000 years ago, all three of us come into existence. Modern humans, Neanderthals, and the Denisovans. And the Neanderthals seem to make their way into Europe and in Western Asia and in Central Asia, up to and including parts of Siberia, whereas it would seem that the Denisovans go east. They pass through Southwest Asia. Some of them go south through South Asia, into Southeast Asia, Papua New Guinea, Australia, that side of it. But others would seem to have gone the high road, if you like, into Central Asia, in Siberia, Tibet, China, Mongolia, that area there.
Right.
And those two different types of Denisovans would seem to have had different histories. But what we can say that all of these individual, hominin groups have their own chance, their own time to develop their own genome, their own, physical looks, if you like, their own material cultures, their own territories, etc., etc. But they did encounter each other, particularly, it would seem, in the area of Siberia and Mongolia and possibly Central Asia, countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, places like that. And this was a melting pot of, of interbreeding between these different people. So you had Denisovans and Neanderthals interbreeding. You had humans and Denisovans. Humans, obviously, also interbred with Neanderthals. And all this was going on. I mean, there's no question that this area of Central Asia, Siberia, would have been almost like the Middle Earth of a J.R.R. Tolkien novel. You'd have had tall guys who may well have been the Denisovans. You'd have had, the guys in the middle, possibly ourselves, and a smaller individuals who are the Neanderthals, and there may have almost certainly have been smaller people than that. People related to Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit of the island of Flores in Indonesia, and other ones as well, possibly even Homo erectus. And Homo erectus are another branch of the tree. They would seem to have come down from the common ancestor a lot earlier than modern humans. And they were around and dominated the world from around, I'm going to say about 1.5 million years ago, perhaps even earlier, down to around 4 to 500,000 years ago. And then what happens is that they are replaced in many areas of the planet by these other incoming peoples, the Denisovans, the Neanderthals, and ourselves. Although some of them did linger on, particularly in Southeast Asia, some Homo erectus right the way through till around 25,000 years ago. So, you got all these and almost certainly other types of so-called archaic humans hanging around, and all of them contribute to the greater scheme of things. But I can honestly say that the Denisovans would seem to have been the ones that moved ahead faster than anybody else. And they also look different. I mean, all the indications at the moment are that they were big. They were very wide. They were probably quite tall. Now, how big, we don't know. I mean, their teeth, look as if they are twice the size of modern humans. And although some skeptics have said, oh, well, teeth have, no factor on how big a person is. So that's actually not right. Studies do show that big teeth does equal big people. So the chances are that when we find a whole Denisovan, which we haven't done yet, we've only got a couple of fragments of skull, which are very thick and big. We've got a jawbone, which was found as early as 1980 in Tibet, but was only recently identified as that of a Denisovan. We have other bits and pieces, and we have other jawbones and skulls, which we can't determine exactly yet whether they are Denisovan or not, although they look like they could be. I mean, one, for instance, was found in the so-called Penghu Channel off of the coast of Taiwan a few years ago. It was dredged up by fishermen, and that's big, and it's very similar. The jawbone, at least, is very similar to that of the jawbone, the mandible that was found in Tibet. So that also is probably a Denisovan.
So that you're saying it's not 100% sure, but because of the similarities, that's why they think it's a Denisovan.
Yeah. I mean, the dentistry is incredibly close. In fact, so close that the chances of it being the same seems, is incredibly remote. And the other important thing is, because we did interbreed with the Denisovans, we can tell where they went, because there are certain populations that have quite a high percentage of Denisovan DNA, particularly in Southeast Asia, island Southeast Asia, like Indonesia, also just to the north of there in the Philippines, Papua New Guinea and Australia. These areas have incredibly high levels of Denisovan DNA, anything up to, well, I say 3 to 5, some estimates of 5 to 6%. In other areas, it could be up to 3%. Interesting enough, in Europe, it's almost non-existent.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, certainly officially. I mean, the only population that does have a little is the Finns, and particularly the Sami people. And one of the reasons for that is that they already are known to have anything up to about 6% Asian DNA anyway. So, they've obviously inherited some of that Denisovan DNA through the fact that their ancestors travelled westwards from beyond the Ural Mountains, and bringing with them that DNA. Now, that doesn't mean that there was never any Denisovan DNA in Europe. What it means is that the peoples that came out of Africa and took over the show in Europe from about 45,000 years ago have whitewashed any Denisovan DNA that might have been there, and that it's just no longer present. So,
Andrew, I want to ask since you said that a lot of it's in the Asian culture, that there's a lot of DNA of Denisovan, but
yeah,
they were large, but most Asians are fairly smaller frame, smaller. How did we determine that they carry that gene predominantly? Well, over other people, Europeans.
yeah, that's
especially.
a good point. That's a good point. I mean, there is a gene that makes us tall.
Right.
There is a gene that allows us to be small. There's a gene, for everything. The immunity genes to allow us to live in extremely high environments, like the Tibetans and the Sherpas, who have genes that were actually passed to them by the Denisovans, and that quite clearly had been developed by the Denisovans for hundreds of thousands of years prior to being given to us through interbreeding.
Right.
And so obviously there's genes relating to height, and quite clearly if that gene wasn't passed on into any successive generations, then the people are not going to be tall anymore. But quite clearly it's going to have gone somewhere, and we do know obviously that there were hundreds, if not thousands, of oversized skeletons in America found within the mounds and cemeteries of Native American peoples. From the Mississippian period, from the Adena period, about 2,000 years ago, and even earlier than that probably date back to 3,000 to 4,000 BC. That were all there, were all available in the past, and unfortunately today have been repatriated or indeed lost, because they're no longer in the institutions and museums, and were repatriated part of the NAGPRA law that came at the beginning of the 1990s. So we can't test them to find out if they are Denisovans, but the chances are they probably are. So in other words, there is strains of tall people who continued with these tall genes, if you like, that continued on and reached the Americas and probably remained in isolation, relative isolation, through until the time of first contact with Europeans. And in fact, there are a number of accounts by early Europeans of extremely tall individuals. I mean, and not just individual people, but whole groups of, okay, let's use the G word, giants, that were encountered and were seen, and notes and records made of their existence, not just in North America, but in South America, and obviously in the area of Patagonia, particular. I mean, there was Patagonian giants certainly through until the 18th century, but unfortunately, as with everything, we just destroy. I mean, and we killed them all. I mean, literally, we just went around killing them all until there were no more, until the height began to decrease and decrease. And by the time explorers reached, let's say, Patagonia in the 19th century, now there were no people other than about 6.5 feet in height. So, of course, the skeptics at that time said, oh, well, clearly there never were any giants because we can't see any. But, of course, we killed them all off,
Right.
And the skeletons have been there. And I would put good money on the fact that when we are able to analyze the genomes of a extremely tall individual, from these human groups, we will find that they have Denisovan connections. If we don't, then I'll come out and say, well, I was wrong. But I'm pretty certain that we will find, firstly, that the Denisovans were quite large, and secondly, that they are related to the giant skeletons that were found in America.
I was actually, it's funny, about a week ago, a friend of mine is taking an anthropology class, and he was asking me to help him with some stuff. And so I helped him, and it was talking about, there were a certain amount of groups, tens of thousands, 100,000 years ago, but it was talking about the mutations that made characteristics of, from tall to short, whatever, fat. And they said that if you marry somebody that has the same mutation, if it's both tall, you probably come from the same group way down, thousands and thousands of years ago. So this is, and they also said that it does help you track the migration of these people. So, yeah, I think, like you said, there's certain people that, in my family, I'm the tallest. I'm 6 feet, but my dad's 5'8". So, I think there are a lot of mutations in certain people's families that do trace back to these groups. So
true. I mean, obviously, some giants, if you like, do suffer, if that's the right word, from gigantism,
right.
which is a genetic abnormality. And some people have said, well, these giant skeletons that were found in Native American graves, perhaps that's all they were. But, Greg, my co-author on Denisovan origins, looked into this, and he did statistics based on the discovery of giant skeletons in a particular zone, that being the Kanawha Valley of West Virginia, where there were literally dozens and dozens of them found, and weighed this against the amount of bodies that were discovered that were of normal size, and found that the percentage of oversized skeletons was far more than in any typical community where gigantism is reported. In other words, it couldn't possibly be the answer. Gigantism was not the answer. These were a human group of large size. And you talk about, families having extremely tall people in it. Well, there are parts of Britain, for instance, where it's renowned that people will grow anything up to 7 feet tall. I mean, in Cornwall, there are certain towns and villages down there, where people are regularly 6.5 to 7 feet in height, and these particular villages, for instance, are known for the athletes, tall athletes who for some reason end up being boat rowers in boat races. I'm not quite sure why, but maybe it's they've just got more power or something. I don't know, but. And also in Wales, there are certain places in Wales where, the average height was, 6.5 feet or more. And yet, down the road, the height was much less. And this was recorded in studies that were done, let's say, in the 19th century, early 20th century, and quite clearly show that the populations have a gene relating to tallness, but it's just not there in other communities.
Yeah, and I do find that fascinating, because like my brother, he's 5'10", 150, and can eat everything he wants and never gain weight. I'm 6 feet, 220, and can eat a Tic Tac, and I gain 15 pounds. So
yes,
genetics. But what I'm curious, that since we found most of the remnants in a cave, do we know, or could we tell in any other parts of the world their influence on architecture or anything that they influenced our society or even ancient societies from their culture?
Right. Well, if you look at the area around the Denisova cave in Siberia, for instance, there are a number of other caves where material from the same epoch, let's say 45 to 60, 70,000 years ago, are being uncovered. But because they haven't found any bones yet, they can't say for certain that these, this human activity, if you like, belongs to the Denisovans. Chances are it probably was. But what's so interesting is in this same area, there are a number of legends to do with giant communities who existed there in the past. And it was said that these giants, not only in some cases became the ancestors of the first humans to reach the area, but that they also had high culture, that they built the first bridges, they constructed the first irrigation channels. They built the first stone houses, and that they created the earliest musical instruments, which is in keeping with the fact that the earliest musical instrument we've got so far comes from the Denisova cave, the Denisovan layer. So there are traditions about these giants existing before us. You go to Tibet as well. In Tibetan Buddhism, for instance, there are a number of cosmogonic legends and traditions, i.e., who were the founders, before modern humans. And it is said that before the first human dynasties ruled in Tibet, the Tibet was ruled by giants and ogres called the Surim and Buddhad. And they had their own dynasties and whatever, and were either wiped out or just disappeared at the time of the first humans came along. Now, in the fact that we now have material evidence of Denisovans both in Tibet and also in Siberia, I suspect very strongly that these legends do preserve some memory, as distorted or abstract as it is, of the presence of Denisovans in these regions. And if that's the case, then it's very clear that they did have some form of high culture. Now, clearly, we've not found any building structures from that age that we can attribute to the Denisovans. There is the possibility of some large stone megalithic blocks and structures in Siberia, which are natural monuments that may have been moved around a bit. In other words, they are natural geological features, but some of the rocks seem to be out of place to a degree of intelligent movement, suggesting that somebody has been there doing stuff. And if that's the case, there's no record of us doing it. The chances are that there are going to be legends that would associate these sites with giants and the giants moving around stones. So there is a possibility that they were creating some of the earliest megalithic monuments. However, that is pure speculation at this time, but it's worth throwing in to the melting pot just to not forget that, I think. But beyond that is the influence, I think, in the architecture from the point of view of sacred geometry. Because what we haven't looked at yet is the mindset of the Denisovans. And from a quite early stage, it seemed as if the Denisovans had genes as part of their genome that in modern humans are associated with autism, or those on the autistic spectrum. And this has been confirmed with a new study that came out only a couple of months ago. I wrote an article about this for Ancient Origins website. And it does strongly hint at the fact that the Denisovans had a completely different approach to nature and the world around them. One that I don't think it would be right to see them as autistic, but they had senses and an awareness of the world around them that when it was passed on to us, it comes across as a little strange. And also the byproduct of that is the inheritance by us of certain so-called savant skills, most obviously calendar counting. Now, calendar counting is the ability of a savant to, for you to be able to give them a date in the future, let's say the 26th of September, 2052, and for them to instantaneously say that's a Thursday. I'm not saying it is, but, maybe it is. But, they can do this, not just for the future, but in the past, and not just for the 100 years. I mean, there was a savant twins who could predict 40,000 years, any date, 40,000 years into the future and 40,000 years into the past. Now, I have read books on savants, and here it is stated very clearly that not only did they have, almost like an extra sensory perception in the past that would have been beneficial to slowly not evolving, but evolving humans of the past, but also it may have had functions that we've now lost, and that calendar counting was almost certainly associated with calendrical counting. In other words, the use of the sun and the moon to predict for the future, and not just for the coming year, or perhaps even one particular eclipse cycle, but
Right.
perhaps hundreds or thousands or even millions of eclipse cycles. And if that's the case, then the numbers that become familiar to those eclipse cycles, which are things like 54, 108, 216, 432, 864, which are all found in sacred literature throughout Asia in connection with cycles of time, the yugas, the kalpas of India, um, the sacred architecture of buildings like Angkor Wat in Cambodia, Borobudur in Java, which has 432 Buddhas in stupas upon its cosmic mountain that represents Meru, the center of the world. The use of all of these sacred numbers that crop up again and again and again is the byproduct of an almost savant-like mind that is remembering and preserving multiples of these particular configurations of numbers: 54, 72, 108, 216, 432 in particular, that relate to the cycles of kings, legendary, or divine kings. You find that in Sumeria, for instance. It's there within the Chinese time cycles, 432,000 and stuff like this. And all of these numbers, I think, are generated by a combination of the movements of the sun and the moon, particularly eclipse cycles. And this is the sort of material that's going to be created by a savant-like mind in the past. And the earliest manifestation of this comes from the area of Siberia and Mongolia, and dates back from archaeological objects to around 24,000 years ago, from a place called Malta, Mal'Ta, which is to the west of the huge inland sea called Lake Baikal. And even with the discovery of this beautiful figurine of a cave lion recently, it's got these rows of notches on it. There are 18 rows. Now, 18 is a number associated with the so-called Saros lunar cycle. It's an 18-year cycle. But each of the rows of notches has 4 strikes, or 4 notches.
Right.
So 4 times 18 is 72. 72 is obviously a sacred number associated with the movement of the sun against the background of the stars, but also it's 1/5 of a year of 360 days. And, although we might say, well, hold on, isn't this something of our creation, perhaps within the past, 5,000-6,000 years? I don't think so. I think that this knowledge of certain numbers that are very important, which relate to the cosmic time, it relates to the cycles of time, cyclic time as it's known, has been very, very important to our ancestors going all the way back to the time of the Denisovans, particularly the Denisovans. The Neanderthals do not have the same autistic genes as the Denisovans. Now, it's possible that we gain at least some of these genes from the Denisovans. It's possible. If we didn't gain them from them, what we can say is that we've got them and so did they, so that their brain could be very similar to the way that when mutated, they become autistic. It allows people to be on the autistic spectrum, within modern humans.
Right. Yeah. My niece is autistic, and so I've seen how highly intelligent they are, and it sounds like the Denisovan. I can't ever say it. Denisovan. No, I can't say it.
Denisovan.
There we go. Denisovan. That they sound like they're very highly intelligent. And I'm also curious. One thing that we know about, like, the Egyptians, because of hieroglyphs, we get to see a lot about how they believed in their spiritual life and how they lived. Were there any type of hieroglyphs, or do we know anything about their beliefs in the afterlife or God or who they worshipped at all?
No, is the honest answer. I think, this cave lion figurine could be the first evidence, really.
Right.
However, I suspect that, like the Neanderthals who used cloaks of feathers, they had necklaces of talons of birds like eagles, raptors, vultures.
Mm-hmm.
That we will see that they were seriously into shamanism, particularly shamanism associated with large birds.
Hmm.
Particularly, this is the other important thing, and also swans. The area of Siberia and Mongolia is known for what's known as swan ancestry. And this is the belief that the genetrix, the mother of a particular clan or tribe, is descended from a particular individual. And amongst the people of Siberia and Mongolia, it's a swan maiden who was divine in origin, but that came down to earth, um, often with her sisters, and they all take off their swan garment and leave it by the side of water. They go and bathe, and then a hunter comes along, takes a fancy to one of the girls, steals her swan garment so that she can't transform back into a swan again. So she's forced to have to marry this hunter. They have children. She eventually finds a way of regaining her swan garment, flies back to bird heaven, which is quite literally what it's called, or birdland. But what have you got? You've got children who are descended of this swan maiden, of this divine swan, who are, who continue that ancestry through to the modern day. And many Siberians and Mongolians pride their swan ancestry. What I argue in the books, Cygnus Key, and also in Denisovan Origins, is that this is an extremely ancient belief, one that's Paleolithic in origin. So it's almost certainly, a minimum of 20,000 years old, possibly more. And I think it does relate to the Denisovans. There is other indications of swan shamanism going on in the area of Siberia, connected with stories of giants. And I think that this is some memory, once again, of the Denisovans and what they were up to there. And what we're also doing is trying to trace the origins of the Denisovans themselves. And these originally probably did come out of Africa, and they passed through the Levant, the area that is today, Lebanon,
Right.
Syria, Israel, Palestine, etc. Out of Africa, going through into Asia. And what we know is that important things were going on in what is today Israel around 400 to 450,000 years ago, a huge transition from the previous type of people that lived there, who was Homo erectus, um, to a new type of human group or hominin coming into the area who were incredibly advanced. And the showcase, site of theirs at the moment is a place called the Kezem Cave, just outside of Tel Aviv. And this was only discovered in 2000, and I'm going out there just in a few weeks'
Oh,
time.
nice.
Because what we found here is that these people, these unique people who almost seem to be like a proto form of modern humans, and I argue are also linked with the Siberian Denisovans, would seem to be into shamanism. The earliest manifestation anywhere in the world of shamanism, and it's using the totem of a swan. And this comes in the form of a swan wing bone, which was a particularly important bone to use for shamanism, that's been marked and has clearly had the feathers purposely removed, possibly for use as a garment. And the bone itself seems to have been used, as paraphernalia in ceremonies and rituals, possibly to gain flight within an invisible, world that was thought to coexist with our own. And it could well be that the connection of shamanism with the Denisovans goes all the way back to this time. And the swan was a very important symbol of theirs all the way through. And eventually, when we interbreed with the Denisovans and carry forward their legacy, the memory of the importance of the swan continues on with our own ancestors.
Well, we only have about 7 minutes left, but I do want to ask this question is, I've talked to many Native Americans, and they've always talked about the giants. And, I've heard many stories about finding giant bones in America. And with you saying that Asia had a lot of the DNA of I never can say it. I'm just going to say the
Denisovans.
Denisovans.
Yeah, just call them, or the Dennis. Just call them the Dennis.
It's kind of like saying cinnamon and cinnamon. All right. But so a lot of the Native Americans come from the ancient Asian culture. So do you think there's a connection between the Native Americans talking of the folklore of giants, that the connection of those two of coming over during the Ice Age there?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is probably where my colleague Greg Little will take up the mantle when he comes on the show.
Yeah.
But essentially, yes, it does appear as if Denisovans reached the Americas. There are certain tribes, particularly the Ojibwa and the Cree, that do show the potential of Denisovan DNA up to 3%. That doesn't mean they've all got 3%, but they can have it anything up to 3%. So they themselves clearly got it from somewhere, clearly from their ancestors, either coming across from Asia through the Russian Far East, across the Beringia land bridge, or, as we show in the book, that there is very, very good evidence to suggest that the Solutrean peoples came across Europe and remained there for about 5,000 years, from about 20 to 15,000 BC, and that they themselves created boats that were able to navigate the ice flows and reach the areas of the Chesapeake Bay, possibly as early as 18 to 20,000 years ago, and that there have been a number of beautiful stone blades, leaf points found in the Chesapeake Bay area that match almost exactly Solutrean points from France and Spain. And even one of them is manufactured of a type of stone that is only found in France, believe it or not. But anyway, but what we show, and the Solutreans are a very controversial subject. Some bad people have used all of this to suggest that, Europeans reached Americas before Asians, whatever. But what we show in Denisovan origins is that Solutreans were most certainly of Asian origin. They were North Asians coming out of Siberia and Mongolia, as far east as that.
And I was just thinking that, being big people, or do you think that could be a lot of folklore about the ancient, like Bigfoot and Sasquatch? Is there any connection at all that might have some connection to those two?
Well, certainly as far as the legends are concerned, yes.
Right.
I mean,
it would make
the
sense.
Stories of giant hairy people.
Right.
I mean, there are hundreds of these accounts, for instance, in California. Obviously, there are many more in New England.
Right.
In other parts of the states. They're there. I mean, you can't get away from them.
Right.
So there is, I think that this is a memory of small groups of Denisovans that continued on in the Americas right the way through to the time of contact, and perhaps even as late as the 19th century. But as far as Bigfoot is concerned, I mean, for me, I think Bigfoot is more a paranormal creature.
Yeah,
I don't think it's something
so
that exists all the time in our world, or if it does, it hides itself so well that I just don't understand what's going on. But to me, I don't necessarily link it directly with Denisovans, but some scholars have. This is the interesting thing, so I would never discount that. That certainly there's a relationship somewhere, some connection. Who knows? Maybe some Denisovans ended up in a parallel universe and became the Bigfoot and occasionally come back and see us. I don't know.
Right.
I just made that up, by the way. I don't know. That's probably not true.
Well, it's fascinating, this whole subject, because new human species are being discovered all the time. There was one in the Philippines in a cave, and I think, eventually, hopefully, that we can all again tie this together and figure out a little bit more about each other, on how it all works. And I really appreciate you writing this book and coming on once again. And we're going to have your partner in crime, Greg Little, come on and talk about the Native America part of it. I think that's going to be so fascinating. And again, thank you for sharing all this wisdom. You always bring it. You always fascinate everybody, and everybody in the chat room is loving having you on. So, Andrew, thank you again for being on Truth Be Told.
Thank you, Tony. Okay, and obviously, if anybody is interested in, what I'm up to, andrewcollins.com, my website, everything is on there. All the links, social media, tours that we're doing to Turkey and Egypt and Britain.
Oh my God! So much
and obviously
fun.
all the books. So, and obviously the conference is coming up. So, I'm at the Human Origins conference next April in Albuquerque. Lots of big names there. I'm one of the keynote speakers there on the Denisovans. So may well see you there.
Well, we're gonna try. Captain Ron and myself will try to make it out there, because we enjoy having Andrew on. He's always so fascinating. So, all right, everybody, please go to andrewcollins.com, pick up the book, and he has tons of books that you can find out information about a lot of civilizations and ancient groups out there that we didn't even know about. And it's something new is discovered all the time, and that's why we try to bring them here on Truth Be Told. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Listen to us on Apple Podcast, iHeartRadio, Spotify, anywhere you can find podcasts, you can find it. We really appreciate you leaving a review, sharing the show, and again, we want to thank Andrew for joining us. So once again, this is Tony Sweet for Captain Ron. I'll see you next time on Truth Be Told.